Tonight, I'm going to tell you the secret story of Freemasonry, a 600-year trail of rituals, symbols, whispered oaths, and conspiracies that refuse to die. We'll follow it from its legendary beginnings to the lodges of Europe and America, through revolutions, scandals, disappearances, and the kind of power that doesn't always leave fingerprints. If you like these stories, please like and subscribe. It's the best way to support the channel. And tell me in the comments, do you think Freemasonry is mostly tradition or mostly influence? Thank you for being here. Now, close your eyes if you want, and let us begin. If you ask a Freemason where it all started, you often do not get a date in the way a historian would give you one. You get a scene, a king in Jerusalem who wants a temple that will outlast his own life, a chosen architect named Hiram Abiff who knows the plan and the measurements, a work site divided into ranks with passwords that separate the master from the man who only carries stone. In that telling, the first lodge is not a social club. It is the inner circle around the building of the first Temple of Solomon, which tradition places about 3,000 years ago. The story says that 3 jealous workmen try to force the secret of the master word out of Hiram. When he refuses, they kill him. The body is hidden. Later, he is raised again through a special grip and word known only to the initiated. For generations, this drama has been repeated in Masonic rituals as the central lesson about loyalty, honor, and the price of betrayal. It also serves another purpose. It plants the idea that the order is rooted in the earliest era of sacred architecture, that its secrets are woven into the stones of a holy city, and that the line of transmission reaches back to a time when kings, priests, and builders shared confidences the rest of the world could only guess at. From the point of view of an investigator, that myth is a kind of map. It tells you what the fraternity wants to believe about itself. It claims age. It claims intimacy with the biblical past. It suggests that the real history of power has always involved a small group of people who know more than the public. That alone has been enough to feed centuries of speculation. Some writers have taken the Hiram story and extended it further, arguing that the secrets preserved in Solomon's temple came from even older sources, Egyptian schools of geometry, Babylonian star watchers, or the priestly class that guarded sacred measurements and calendars across the ancient Near East. They point out that the temple in Jerusalem was built with precise proportions, that these ratios appear again in later monuments, and then they draw a straight line to Masonic symbols like the square, the compasses, the all-seeing eye, and the unfinished pyramid. In this reading, the lodge is not a social invention of the early modern age. It is the latest visible layer of a much older system for storing and passing on special knowledge about number, proportion, and order, knowledge that has always had a political edge because it can be used to design cities, plan fortifications, and even structure religious ritual. If you set the legend aside for a moment and look at what survives in archives, the first solid traces of something recognizably Masonic appear in medieval Europe, not in a temple city, but in the cold work yards of cathedrals and castles. From the 12th century onward, great stone buildings rise across the continent. Their arches, vaults, and towers require a level of skill that ordinary village builders do not possess. The men who can perform this work are in demand, and they move from site to site as projects begin and end. To defend their pay and their status, they form lodges and guilds. These are not yet the lodges of modern Freemasonry with their formal degrees, but they have rules, leaders, and customs. They regulate apprenticeships. They set standards for work. They decide who is in and who is out. The word lodge itself referred at first to the physical hut or shelter on the building site where masons met, ate, and stored tools. Over time, it also came to mean the group that met there, the circle of initiates marked off from casual laborers and outsiders. The most important evidence for this world comes in the form of the old charges, a group of handwritten texts copied and recopied from at least the 14th century onward. The oldest known example is often called the Regius manuscript. It appears to date from around the late 1300s. Another early one is known as the Cook manuscript. These documents are sets of regulations, legends, and moral instructions presented as the ancient law of the craft. They outline how a mason should behave toward God, toward his Lord, and toward his fellow workers. They insist on obedience, secrecy, and loyalty. One of the striking features of these texts is that they include a legendary history of the craft that reaches back far beyond any real guild in England. They claim that geometry originated in Egypt, that it was taught by Euclid, that it was brought to England by a noble figure in the time of King Athelstan. This pattern becomes very familiar once you have seen it a few times. A trade that needs to justify its place in a strict social order gives itself a noble, even royal, origin story. The effect is to turn a practical occupation into a tradition with roots in sacred and royal history. In the case of the Masons, it also lays the groundwork for later generations to say, with a straight face, that what they do has always been linked to the hidden structure of civilization. Those guild records also tell us something about secrecy, long before speculative Freemasonry appears. The old charges do not spell out passwords or detailed grips, but they refer to keeping the craft's counsel and to the idea that certain things should not be written down where outsiders might read them. There are hints that Masons had signs by which they recognized each other and by which they proved their level of training. Some scholars have compared this to other medieval trades, which also protected specialized knowledge, but the Masons stand out for one simple reason. They dealt with plans that involved churches, royal projects, and fortifications. Their drawings and their ability to calculate stresses and angles gave them contact with patrons at the very top of society. That fact alone has encouraged later writers to imagine lodge meetings in which not only pay scales and schedules were discussed, but also matters of state, especially in times when kings were at war or when religious reforms made open discussion dangerous. The religious world in which all of this took place was tense and controlled. Europe lived under a church that claimed authority over belief, and it knew from experience that alternative teachings could spread quietly in small groups. Heretical movements had already appeared in the Middle Ages, some of them organized, some of them loose. Authorities were alert to gatherings that did not fit into official structures. Guilds were tolerated because they were necessary. They provided labor and they regulated crowded urban economies. At the same time, the church expected guilds to honor God and to conform outwardly to doctrine. The Masons, whose work was visibly linked to cathedrals and chapels, fit that expectation easily. They processed on feast days, they held masses. To the eye of a bishop, they were pious workers. To writers of later centuries, that made them an ideal cover for any ideas that did not fit official teaching. The image of Masons meeting inside half-finished churches, surrounded by columns and empty spaces that only they understood how to complete, has been irresistible to those who imagine that unorthodox teachings, perhaps about the nature of Christ or the balance of power between church and crown, could have been spoken more freely there than in any pulpit. If the biblical myth of Solomon gives Freemasonry a sacred starting point, another story often used in conspiracy accounts provides a bridge from the Middle Ages to the modern fraternity. This is the story of the Knights Templar. The Templars were a military and religious order founded in the 12th century to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land. Over time, they became wealthy bankers and landholders. In the early 14th century, the French king Philip the Fair moved against them. He had them arrested, charged with heresy, and many were tortured and executed. The order was dissolved by the Pope. That much is in the official record. What happened to the surviving members is harder to trace. In that space, speculation has flourished. According to one popular theory, some Templars fled to Scotland, a kingdom less tightly controlled by the papacy at the time. There, it is said, they joined forces with local building lodges and passed on their knowledge, symbols, and rituals. Supporters of this theory point to certain carvings and designs in Rosslyn Chapel, a 15th century Scottish church, that seem to echo both Templar emblems and later Masonic motifs. They also point out that both groups were associated with the Temple in Jerusalem in their own ways, and that both had a structure of ranks, oaths, and internal discipline. On this basis, they argue that modern Freemasonry is the institutional descendant of a suppressed order that once held great political and financial power in Europe, and that it has preserved elements of Templar tradition under a new name. Professional historians have argued about how strong the evidence is for a direct link between Templars and Masons. It is a difficult question to settle because both orders valued secrecy, both were destroyed or transformed by events, and both inspired later romantic and political writing that is hard to separate from fact. What is clear, however, is that Freemasons themselves in the 17th and 18th centuries began to adopt Templar language and degrees. Higher-level rituals with titles like Knights Templar, Knights of the Temple, and similar names appeared in various Masonic rites. That tells us that the fraternity saw value in connecting itself to the lost military order, whether the bloodline was real or not. It wanted that aura of persecution, bravery, and proximity to the Holy Land. For conspiracy-minded observers, this adoption of Templar themes looks like an admission. If the rituals remember the older order, perhaps the lodge records do too, under another form. Perhaps a network built to command knights and manage treasure learned to survive underground by adopting a humbler face. While these layers of legend and association accumulated, the daily reality of Mason lodges in late medieval and early modern Europe continued in a more work-centered way. Apprentices came as boys to a building site. They lived with a master. They learned to square stones, to dress them, to set them in courses. After years of service, they presented a piece of work to prove their skill. If accepted, they became full members of the craft. They were then allowed to travel and to set their mark on stones as a sign of responsibility. Many cathedrals still bear such marks. simple geometric symbols cut into corners and joints. For most of the men who carved them, the lodge was a mixture of school, union, welfare society, and religious confraternity. It helped bury members, supported widows, and maintained an internal justice that kept disputes from spilling into the streets. None of that is mysterious in itself. What turns it into something larger, in hindsight, is the decision to attach a particular kind of story to this otherwise ordinary structure. The story that geometry is not only a useful tool, but a sacred language. The story that the craft has always been connected to rulers and priests. The story that certain words and signs, once learned, make a man part of something that stretches far beyond his own town and even beyond his own lifetime. In the 17th century, we begin to see evidence that lodges were admitting men who were not working masons. These were called accepted masons. They were gentlemen, merchants, professionals, often educated. They came for various reasons. Some admired the moral code and mutual aid. Some were attracted by the secrecy and sense of belonging. Some may have seen it as a way to build networks across class lines. This development is crucial because it gradually shifts the center of gravity from operative craft to speculative symbolism. Once a lodge can contain men who never plan a building, its rituals and stories take on more weight than its practical rules. The biblical legends, the old charges, the talk of ancient origins, all gain importance as the shared material that holds this mixed company together. At that point, the Solomon story, the Euclid story, and the Templar story become more than ornaments. They become the backbone of an identity that is no longer tied to any one trade. By the time a new form of Freemasonry emerges in London in the early 18th century, with formal grand lodges and published constitutions, it can present itself as the heir to all of this. To ancient temple building, to medieval guild discipline, to persecuted knightly orders, to a secret line of knowledge about numbers, architecture, and morality that has supposedly survived fires, wars, and reforms. Whether that line is as unbroken as believers claim is a question that different people answer in different ways. What matters for our story is that the claim exists, that it is repeated, and that it has consequences. It makes Freemasonry look older than most modern institutions. It makes it look harder to control. It makes it look as if every time rulers thought they had shut a door on some dangerous mixture of wealth, knowledge, and loyalty, the same force found another room in which to meet. In the 17th century, long before most people had heard the word Freemason in its modern sense, there were already signs that the old building lodges were changing. The evidence is not dramatic. It appears in short diary entries and scattered records. One of the most cited comes from an English antiquary named Elias Ashmole. In 1646, he noted that he had been made a Freemason in a lodge at Warrington. Ashmole was not a working mason. He was a gentleman, a scholar, a collector of manuscripts and curiosities. His presence inside a lodge tells us that the doors were opening to men who did not earn their living with stone and mortar. It is one of several hints that the craft was moving from an occupational body toward a broader fraternity. Lodges had begun accepting men drawn by curiosity, social contact, or a sense that these meetings contained something more than a wage agreement or a welfare fund. By the early 18th century, this shift reached a point where it could be organized at a new level. On a June day in 1717, 4 London lodges met at a tavern known as the Goose and Gridiron. Representatives elected a Grand Master and formed what they called the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. The act sounds simple. In context, it meant that separate lodges would now recognize a central authority, share a set of rules, and coordinate their activity. They took practices that had grown informally over centuries and placed them under a written constitution. That document, known as the Constitutions of the Freemasons, was published in 1723 under the name of a Presbyterian minister named James Anderson. It contained a version of the old charges, a legal framework for lodge governance, and an expanded legendary history of the craft. Anderson reached back to the builders of Babel, to ancient Egypt, to Solomon, and then forward through European kings, presenting Masonry as a continuous thread running through civilization. For members, this narrative framed their meetings as the latest chapter in a very long story. For critics, it was evidence that the organization took itself seriously in ways that demanded attention. The rules Anderson set down also gave the fraternity a particular character. They required belief in a supreme being, but they discouraged political and sectarian dispute inside lodge rooms. The idea was that men of different denominations could meet on neutral ground if they agreed to leave certain arguments at the door. God was invoked as the great architect of the universe, a title that fit easily with a craft rooted in building. This arrangement suited an age when religious wars were recent memory and when many educated people were turning toward what would later be called Enlightenment values. The lodge became a place where a merchant, a lawyer, a minor aristocrat, and a clergyman could sit as brothers and discuss morality, science, and public matters in a controlled setting. Membership did not erase social rank, but it created a parallel hierarchy based on degrees and offices that were held for fixed periods and filled by election. From the start, this structure encouraged a habit of meeting and deciding that had political implications. A typical lodge kept minutes, elected officers, handled funds, and voted on candidates. Men learned to speak in an ordered way, to propose and second motions, to argue without breaking the peace of the room. These were the same skills needed in councils, parliaments, and committees. Lodge charity also required organization. Subscriptions were collected. Relief was given to widows and sick brothers. Money moved according to agreed rules rather than personal favor. For a man who wanted to practice leadership in a public yet private context, the lodge offered a training ground. It is not surprising that many of those who later appear in political life first tested their abilities inside these rooms. As the London Grand Lodge asserted itself, other centres responded. In Ireland and Scotland, existing lodges had their own traditions and did not always accept direction from London. Scottish records show operative lodges much older than many English ones. They prized their independence and their local customs. In time, separate grand lodges formed in Edinburgh and Dublin. In England itself, disagreements arose over ritual, membership policy, and control. By the middle of the century, there were two rival bodies, one calling itself the Moderns, the other the Ancients. Both claimed to preserve the true practice of Masonry. The split created a situation that outsiders found confusing, but that members navigated with care. A man initiated under one authority might or might not be accepted in a lodge under the other. Networks of loyalty formed not only around the craft as a whole, but around particular versions of it. Across the Channel, Freemasonry arrived in France in the 1722. British and Irish lodges founded branches in Paris and other cities. French nobles and officers joined, attracted by the novelty and by the promise of mixing with foreigners and with members of different ranks on terms of ritual equality. In France, the fraternity absorbed local tastes. Elaborate higher degrees developed, often with titles that referred to chivalry, the temple, and mystical themes. These new layers of ritual went beyond the 3 craft degrees common in England. They offered initiates progression through an ordered series of secrets, each level adding signs, words, and stories. Some systems reached 30 or more degrees. The effect was to create an internal ladder that extended upward even after a man had become a full master mason. This made the organization more absorbing for those who liked ceremony. It also deepened the sense that there were inner circles and hidden teachings to which only a few would ever gain access. The spread did not stop in France. Lodges appeared in the German states, in the Dutch Republic, in Italy, in Spain, and in the Scandinavian kingdoms. In many places they were introduced by officers returning from foreign service, by merchants, and by diplomats. They often began in port, cities, and capitals, where populations were more mixed and authorities were used to managing foreign influences. The fraternity presented itself as a school of virtue, a space for rational discussion, and a supporter of charity. In practice, it gathered men who were already connected or who wanted to be. In Catholic countries, this combination of private meetings, non-clerical moral teaching, and contact with foreigners drew suspicion. The papacy responded with formal condemnations. In 1738, Pope Clement XII issued a bull that forbade Catholics from joining lodges, citing their oaths, their secrecy, and their indifferent approach to religious difference. Similar decrees followed under later popes. These rulings did not stop Masonry, but they pushed it into a grey zone where membership could be both prestigious and risky. In Protestant countries, where the church was aligned with the state rather than above it, the response was more mixed. Some rulers saw lodges as harmless or even useful places where loyal subjects could meet. Others worried about any group that met behind closed doors without direct control. In some German principalities, princes took leadership roles in the craft to keep it under their eye. In others, police spies attended meetings. The British state, which had a long history of monitoring dissenting clubs and coffeehouse circles, watched but rarely moved against Masonry as such. The fact that many officers and colonial administrators were members made direct suppression less appealing. Instead, concerns were expressed indirectly through pamphlets and satire, which mocked the pretension of men who played at mystery with rolled-up trousers and passwords. The British Empire provided the roads for further expansion. Army regiments carried travelling warrants that allowed them to open lodges wherever they were posted. Sailors formed lodges in ports across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Merchants opened lodges in trading cities where European communities took root. In North America, lodges appeared in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston. Some were chartered directly from London. Others received warrants from Irish or Scottish authorities. These colonial lodges brought together men who would later play major roles in local politics and in the eventual break with Britain. At this stage, however, They functioned mainly as clubs for mutual assistance, social contact, and discussion. Within the lodge room, certain practices reinforced the sense of belonging to a distinct and structured body. Candidates were proposed and vetted. A secret ballot using white and black balls determined acceptance. A single negative vote from a member could keep a man out. Once initiated, a brother could travel and seek admission to other lodges by giving the correct signs and words. Officers sat in fixed stations, facing each other across the room. Rituals followed a set pattern, with questions and answers that every member was expected to learn. The physical layout and the spoken forms created a recognizable environment that could be reproduced in any town or port if enough members were present. This standardization allowed a man to move from Scotland to London to Boston and still feel that he knew the rules of the room he entered. Membership lists from this period show a range of occupations and ranks. In urban lodges, one could find craftsmen, shopkeepers, printers, lawyers, civil servants, and sometimes titled men. The presence of printers and publishers is notable because it meant that Masonry had direct links into emerging public spheres of newspapers and pamphlets. Ideas discussed in a lodge might later appear, stripped of identifying marks, in essays about government, morality, or civic life. The fraternity did not need a formal policy to influence debate. It only needed members who wrote and spoke in other venues. At the same time, there were clear limits. Most lodges admitted only men. In many places, there were informal or formal barriers to admitting Jews, people of color, or those without property. Some of these limits reflected broader social prejudices. Others were part of an effort to keep the fraternity within a respectable band of society. For all its language of equality among brothers, many lodges functioned as selective clubs that filtered entrance. That selectivity made them attractive as spaces where business partnerships could be formed and where political alliances could be tested in relative privacy before being presented to the wider public. The combination of reach, ritual, and discretion was what drew early accusations of secret influence. In the late 18th century, when revolutions shook established orders, conservative writers in Europe began to argue that Masonic lodges were not just reflecting the new ideas of the age, but actively planning and spreading them. They pointed out that the fraternity crossed national borders and that it included men involved in politics, the military, and the economy. They noted that members called each other brothers and owed each other mutual aid. They observed that outrage over events in one country seemed to echo in another, where lodges were strong. From these observations, they drew conclusions about coordination and intent. It is important to note that the lodges themselves cultivated a sense of special knowledge that encouraged such readings. Teachings were framed as light given to the candidate. Symbols were presented as keys to moral and philosophical lessons. Higher degrees claimed to reveal deeper levels of meaning. The atmosphere inside a lodge was designed to make a man feel that he had entered a different order of understanding. In an age fascinated by natural philosophy, secret experiments, and coded societies, this was part of the appeal. It also raised the obvious question in many minds. If men were capable of keeping such secrets about symbols and stories, what else might they be keeping? If they swore to support each other, how far did that support go once members found themselves in councils, courts, and ministries? By the closing decades of the century, Freemasonry had become a familiar presence in cities from London to Philadelphia, from Paris to Vienna. It had also become a screen onto which people projected their hopes and fears about the new kind of public life that was emerging. For some, lodge rooms represented a model of civil society. For others, they looked like rehearsal halls for hidden influence. The same network that could organize charity and promote education could also, in the eyes of critics, organize dissent and promote agendas never submitted to the wider population. By the middle of the 18th century, Freemasonry had moved from being an English project with foreign branches into a network that could survive changes in government and survive across borders. That mattered because the Atlantic world was entering a period when old political habits were breaking and new ones were being invented in real time. People often described the American and French revolutions as explosions of ideas, but the day-to-day reality was organization. Men had to meet, argue, vote, coordinate, raise funds, keep secrets, recruit allies, and maintain discipline when the consequences of a careless sentence could be prison or death. In that environment, the appeal of the lodge was practical. It offered a ready-made structure, a process for admitting trusted people, a vocabulary of fraternity, and a habit of private meeting that did not look unusual in cities already full of clubs, guilds, and societies. This is the point where Freemasonry becomes hard to separate from the wider political culture, because the same men who attended lodge also served on committees, printed newspapers, ran businesses, and held public office. Even when the lodge did not issue political orders, it produced relationships, and relationships are often what decide how power moves. In the American colonies, lodges existed before independence and grew as ports and towns grew. They were part of a larger associational life in British North America, alongside churches, militia organizations, merchant societies, and reading groups. Many of the men who became prominent in revolutionary politics had also joined lodges at some point in their careers. Benjamin Franklin, who spent years moving between Philadelphia, London, and Paris, provides a clear example of how these circles overlapped. He was a printer and publisher, a civic organizer, a diplomat, and a man who understood the value of networks. Freemasonry fit comfortably into that world because it crossed boundaries that formal institutions often could not. A lodge could include merchants who controlled shipping, lawyers who knew the courts, artisans who had influence in the streets, and military officers who could enforce decisions. In the years leading up to open conflict with Britain, those connections mattered for practical tasks like fundraising, distribution of information, and coordination between towns. George Washington's case is often cited because he became a public symbol of the new nation and because his Masonic identity was widely known. He joined a lodge as a young man in Virginia and remained connected to Masonic circles through much of his life. In public ceremonies, during and after the Revolution, Masonic participation was visible, especially in events like cornerstone layings, where the language of building and civic order matched the image of the new republic as a constructed project. Once war began, the question was not whether Masons controlled the revolution, but how a fraternity shaped the environment in which the revolution was organized. The Continental Army was a mobile institution with men from different colonies and backgrounds, and it relied on trust across distance. Military lodges existed in the British Army, and similar practices appeared on the American side. Officers who were members could recognize each other through shared rituals and create quick bonds in settings where formal rank was not always enough to establish loyalty. This is one reason Freemasonry remains central in later stories of a so-called Masonic Republic. The logic goes like this. If you have a network that is already international and already structured by vows, and if you place members of that network in leadership roles during the founding of a new state, then the new state may carry the imprint of that network even if no one ever announces it. Supporters of this view point to the number of prominent founders who were Masons, to the presence of lodges in key cities, and to the way Masonic ideals of virtue, self-control, and civic duty resemble the language used in early American political culture. Critics answer that Masonry was simply one of many associations in an era when men joined multiple clubs and societies. But the suspicion survives because the lodge, unlike most clubs, asked for secrecy and created a bond that could be deeper than ordinary friendship. The revolution also created conditions that made conspiracy thinking normal. People had lived through years of political crisis, where pamphlets accused British officials of hidden plans, where committees of correspondence passed information in semi-secret ways, and where loyalists and patriots watched each other closely. After independence, Americans remained sensitive to the idea that unseen forces could shape public life. It was easy to look at an organization that met privately and ask whether it might become a state within a state. The very strengths that made lodges useful to members, discretion, loyalty, mutual aid, could look like threats to outsiders who believed public life should be open and accountable. In this period, Freemasonry benefited from its association with celebrated founders, but it also inherited the suspicion that follows any group that seems to connect influential men across regions and parties. If the American story is partly about how lodges fit into an existing culture of civic associations, the French story is more volatile because the revolution in France did not end with independence and a settled constitution. It went through phases that turned allies into enemies and made survival depend on political alignment. Freemasonry was well established in France by the late 18th century, especially among elites and professionals. The Grand Orient of France became a central governing body, and its lodges attracted nobles, officers, writers, and administrators. Philippe of Orléans, who later took the name Philippe Égalité, is the figure most often used to show how deeply Masonry could be tied to high politics. He was a royal cousin, wealthy, ambitious, and involved in political reform circles. He also served as Grand Master of French Masonry in the years before the Revolution. His life shows the limits of any idea that Masonry guaranteed protection. He voted for the execution of King Louis XVI and was later executed himself, a reminder that membership in a fraternity did not override the logic of revolutionary power. The French Revolution produced a specific kind of claim about Freemasonry that would echo for centuries. It was not only that Masons were present in the revolutionary movement, but that the lodges had prepared the revolution, organized it, and used it to destroy church and monarchy. This argument gained force, not because it was proven in a courtroom sense, but because it suited the needs of people trying to explain a disaster. After the Terror, Many French conservatives and clergy wanted a single cause that could make sense of the collapse of old authority. A secret society was an attractive answer because it moved responsibility away from broad social conditions and toward a manageable enemy. Writers like Abbé Augustin Baruel argued that revolutionary violence was not a spontaneous outcome of hunger, war, and political breakdown, but the result of planning by hidden groups. In these accounts, Freemasons were rarely alone. They were often paired with the Illuminati, radicals, and other imagined networks. The combined picture was that of an underground coalition using lodges as meeting places and using ritual secrecy as cover. Whether or not the lodges actually acted as revolutionary command centers, the claim itself became one of the most influential conspiracy narratives in modern European history. A key reason these claims survived is that the revolution genuinely did create scenes that looked like betrayal within a brotherhood. Men who shared lodge membership could end up on opposite sides of political trials. Some supported constitutional monarchy, others supported republic, others supported radical measures. In a period when political clubs like the Jacobins became centers of power, it was possible for lodge relationships to intersect with club relationships, and for personal loyalties to be tested under extreme pressure. When people later said that brothers sent brothers to the guillotine, they were expressing a real dynamic of revolutionary France, even if the exact lodge connections were often less clear than the story suggests. The lodge may have been one network among many, but it was one of the few that openly prized secrecy, and secrecy makes every political break look like a hidden plot. The transatlantic connection added another layer. France supported the American rebels against Britain, and French officers returned home with experience of a successful revolution. At the same time, American diplomats and visitors moved in French elite circles. Franklin's time in Paris is often used as evidence of how these networks overlapped. He was not only a diplomat negotiating alliances, but also a social figure who understood salons, clubs, and the value of fraternity. In later retellings, this becomes a story of a shared Masonic ideology moving back and forth across the ocean, shaping revolutions as if they were coordinated chapters in a single plan. The evidence for direct coordination at that level is difficult to pin down, but it is also not necessary for the conspiracy idea to work. All that is required is the reality that similar groups existed in both places, that some of the same names appeared in lodge records and political events, and that revolutionary language about liberty and brotherhood sounded similar to the language used inside lodges. It is also important to notice what made Freemasonry distinct from other clubs in the same era. Many political clubs were open in the sense that outsiders could attend or at least observe their public meetings. Newspapers reported their debates, their leaders issued statements. Freemasonry did not operate that way. It did not publish its rituals. It taught through degrees and insisted that parts of its practice remain private. It also built an internal discipline around obedience to lodge rules and respect for hierarchy within the room. That combination could look like a parallel structure of authority. To a person who feared revolution, it was easy to imagine that the lodge was training men to follow orders not from the crown or the church, but from an internal chain of command. To a person who supported reform, it was easy to imagine that the lodge was training men to live by a higher moral code than the corrupt politics around them. both interpretations could attach to the same set of facts. The idea of a Masonic republic, then, is best understood as a conclusion drawn from patterns rather than a document signed in secret. Patterns of membership among influential men, patterns of lodge growth in cities that became centers of revolutionary organizing, patterns of symbols and language that seem to echo from lodge rooms into civic ceremonies, patterns of mutual aid that might look like favor trading when applied in politics. In the United States, the early republic had a culture of ceremonies, processions, and public rites. Masonic lodges were comfortable in that world because they already used ritual and symbolic action. When Masons appeared in public wearing aprons and carrying tools as emblems, it could be read as civic theater or as a sign that a private order was displaying itself openly. When they participated in cornerstone layings and funerals, it could be read as a harmless tradition or as a public claim to ownership of the nation's founding story. In France, where public ceremony became political spectacle, the presence of Masons in both moderate and radical circles allowed conspiracy writers to argue that the fraternity was everywhere, which in turn made it seem as if it must be in control. Outside the revolutionary centers, the reputational consequences were wide. In Catholic Europe, papal condemnations already framed Freemasonry as dangerous, and the French Revolution intensified that perception. In the decades after 1789, conservative governments looked for causes of unrest and saw lodges as one possible channel through which radical ideas moved. In some places, they were suppressed. In others, they were infiltrated. Even in Britain, where Masonry remained more socially accepted, suspicion grew around secret societies in general, especially as fears of French-style revolutions spread. People began to treat membership in any oath-bound group as evidence of potential disloyalty. The lodge became a symbol in political debates, sometimes used by reformers to signal enlightenment and progress, sometimes used by conservatives to signal hidden subversion. In the 1,820 seconds, the United States was still young enough that reputations and institutions could change quickly, but old enough that people had begun to argue about what kind of country it would become. The language of the revolution was still familiar, and suspicion of concentrated power was still treated as a civic virtue. At the same time, American public life was becoming more organized. Newspapers reached wider audiences. Campaigns were becoming more professional. Fraternal organizations were common, and among them, Freemasonry stood out because of its secrecy and because it attracted men with influence. Lodges were present in towns and cities, and Masons were present in courts, legislatures, banks, and militia structures. For many Americans, that was not automatically alarming. A lodge could be a place for charity and fellowship, but the conditions were already in place for a single scandal to turn Masonry from a private fraternity into a national controversy. That scandal centered on a man named William Morgan. Morgan was not a famous figure in American history before he became one. He was a working man in Western New York who moved through the restless economy of the early republic, where people relocated often, took on new trades, and tried to climb. He had been connected to Masonry, and in the way these stories often begin, he became alienated. Whether his motives were revenge, money, personal grievance, or a belief that the public had a right to know, he threatened to publish what he said were the secrets of the order. That idea struck at the core of what bound the fraternity together. In the lodge world, ritual was not decoration. It was the mechanism that separated insiders from outsiders and created trust across distance. If the words and signs could be printed and sold, then anyone could imitate membership. The badge would lose value, the bond would weaken. The fear was not only embarrassment, it was the collapse of a system that relied on controlled knowledge. The events that followed were messy in details and clean in their effect. Morgan was arrested on charges that looked minor and suspicious. He was held, released, and then taken again. He disappeared. The immediate question was simple. Where did he go? The deeper question was one that Americans were trained to ask. Who had the power to make a man disappear? And what did it say about the equal protection of the law? In the early reporting and later accounts, the story took on a consistent shape. Local Masons, angered by the threatened exposure, used their connections to apply pressure through legal mechanisms. Police officers, sheriffs, jailers, and justices of the peace were alleged to have played roles, or at least to have looked away at critical moments. Men who saw Morgan being moved reported strange coordination, the sense that he was being handled by a group rather than by ordinary law enforcement. Whether Morgan was murdered, kidnapped, or smuggled away, the result was that the public believed something worse than a crime had occurred. They believed the institutions meant to protect citizens had been bent to protect a fraternity. That belief mattered more than any single piece of evidence because it touched a nerve in American politics. The country had fought a war against a distant power accused of arbitrary rule. The Republic's legitimacy depended on the idea that law applied equally and that no private allegiance outranked citizenship. The Morgan affair seemed to present a case where a private oath did outrank public duty. It did not help that Freemasonry's own rules emphasized loyalty to brothers and discretion in the face of outsiders. Critics argued that a Mason in a position of authority would always face a conflict of interest. If a judge, a juror, a sheriff, or a legislator was bound by fraternal loyalty to other Masons, then the public could never be sure where his true allegiance lay. That suspicion became a political weapon. It was aimed not at one lodge or one town, but at the idea of a hidden network inside a democratic system. The reaction in Western New York spread into a wider anti-Masonic movement with unusual speed. Public meetings were held, committees gathered testimony, newspapers printed accusations and counter-accusations. For many citizens, the secrecy of Masonry made ordinary investigation difficult. Lodges did not open their records. Members denied or minimized knowledge. Witnesses were reluctant to speak. That reluctance was interpreted not as individual caution, but as proof of a coordinated cover-up. When prosecutions occurred, they did not resolve the larger suspicion. A few men might be convicted of kidnapping or conspiracy, but the central question remained: who ordered it and why? In the absence of a clear answer, the public filled the gap with a conclusion that seemed to fit the patterns they already believed about Masonry. There must have been an internal decision. There must have been a lodge plan. There must have been a punishment. The missing man became a symbol of what secrecy could do to open society. This was also a moment when American politics was shifting from elite consensus toward mass participation. New voters were entering the system. Party organization was strengthening. Campaigns used newspapers and rallies to shape public opinion. The Morgan Affair turned anti-Masonry into a political identity that could be mobilized. It produced the first durable third-party movement in American history, the Anti-Masonic Party. That party did not form around taxes or tariffs or foreign policy. It formed around the idea that a secret society had corrupted public institutions. That is significant because it shows how deeply the suspicion ran. People were willing to build a political machine around the problem of fraternal secrecy. They held conventions, nominated candidates, issued platforms, and ran campaigns focused on one central claim. No secret order should have private power in a republic. The Anti-Masonic Party also introduced practices that would shape American politics more broadly. It used a national convention to choose a presidential candidate. It built a network of newspapers. It organized at the local and state level. It treated public opinion as something that could be managed through coordinated messaging. In doing so, it borrowed methods that were being adopted across the political spectrum, but it applied them to a single moral issue. This gave the movement a sense of purity and urgency that older parties sometimes lacked. It was not enough to argue that Masons had made a mistake. The anti-Masonic argument was structural. It held that Masonry's very existence as a secret oath-bound organization was incompatible with Republican government. Once that claim was accepted, any Mason in public office could be portrayed as a threat. Freemasonry's defenders responded in several ways, and each response carried risk. Some argued that the fraternity was harmless, that its rituals were symbolic, and that the accusations were irrational. That approach sometimes failed because it sounded dismissive at a time when a man was missing. Others argued that Morgan was not a victim, that he had fled, that he had staged his own disappearance, or that his character made him unreliable. Those arguments sometimes sounded like blame shifting, which reinforced the idea that Masons would say anything to protect the lodge. Another response was silence. Lodges closed ranks, hoping the storm would pass. But silence in a scandal about secrecy is a kind of fuel. It confirms the critic's logic. The order will not answer because it cannot answer without exposing itself. This is where conspiracy thinking became more than an attitude. It became a framework. The Morgan Affair supplied a narrative template that could be used again and again in later decades. A secret society exists. A dissenter threatens exposure. The dissenter suffers an unexplained fate. Authorities behave strangely. The society denies involvement. The public concludes that secrecy itself is the mechanism of control. Once people have that template, they can apply it to other events. They can interpret accidents, career rises, legal outcomes, and political decisions through the lens of invisible coordination. The lodge does not need to prove its power. Its secrecy makes it hard to disprove. In the years after Morgan's disappearance, anti-Masonic sentiment became a social force. It did not remain confined to politics. Churches preached against Masonry. Employers and communities questioned membership. Families argued about whether a man should remain in the lodge. Public ceremonies that included Masonic participation became contested. In some places, Masons resigned or stopped attending meetings. In others, they defended their membership as part of their identity. The country's newspapers turned lodge life into public entertainment, printing descriptions of rituals exposing symbols and mocking the fraternity. The act of exposure became a kind of counter-ritual, a way for outsiders to claim power over a system built on controlled information. At the same time, the movement's intensity created its own distortions. Once Masonry was treated as the hidden cause of injustice, it became tempting to see it everywhere. If a judge ruled in a way someone disliked, it was easy to suspect his lodge ties. If a banker prospered, people could suspect fraternal connections. If a politician received support, there might be a lodge network behind it. The fraternity became a catch-all explanation for outcomes that were otherwise complex. That is one reason the story of the Morgan affair remains important in the larger narrative. It was not only a local crime with national consequences. It was a moment when the American public learned to think of Masonry as a system that could plausibly operate behind the visible institutions of democracy. The United States was a nation built on associations, and the idea that one association might be stronger than the Republic itself was a fear that could be revived whenever trust in institutions weakened. There is also a practical reason the Morgan case struck so deeply. Many Americans knew Masons personally. The lodge was not a distant mystery. It was the store owner, the sheriff, the doctor, the lawyer, the minister, the neighbor. That closeness made the suspicion more intimate. If a lodge could protect its own, then a non-member might worry about being disadvantaged in business, in court, or in civic life. Anti-Masonic rhetoric often returned to that point. It argued that Masonry created two classes of citizens, brothers, and everyone else. That claim was hard to disprove because it was not based on a single event. It was based on a plausible mechanism. Men help their friends. Men help their allies. A ritual oath formalizes that help and extends it beyond personal acquaintance. In a society where access and reputation mattered, that extension looked like a private advantage. The political rise and eventual decline of the anti-Masonic party also shows how these controversies evolve. In some elections, anti-Masonic candidates gained real power, especially at the state level. The movement influenced the agendas of major parties, pushing them to address public concern about secret influence and corruption. Over time, however, other issues took over, including economic conflict and debates over slavery. Many anti-Masons were absorbed into emerging political coalitions. But even as the party faded, the suspicion did not disappear. It became part of American political culture, ready to be revived when new scandals made secrecy look dangerous again. That is a key point for understanding the long history of Masonic conspiracy. The Morgan affair did not settle the question. It created a permanent association between Freemasonry and the idea of hidden power. That association could lie dormant and then return when conditions were right. For Freemasonry itself, the crisis forced adaptation. Lodges became more careful about public image. In some regions, they increased charitable activity and made it more visible, presenting the fraternity as a civic benefit rather than a private club. They emphasized moral teaching and community service. They discouraged political discussion inside lodges more strictly, trying to prove that they were not political machines. Yet the basic structure remained the same. Degrees, signs, words, and private ceremonies continued. The fraternity remained selective, and it continued to reward loyalty among members. That meant the core suspicion could never fully go away. A group can open its charity books to the public, but it cannot open its core identity without becoming something else. The unresolved nature of Morgan's fate also ensured that the story would remain elastic. If there had been a body, a confession, and a clear chain of responsibility, the case might have become history and then faded. Instead, uncertainty preserved it as a living story. Different communities repeated different versions. Some insisted he was killed and hidden, perhaps drowned or buried far from town. Some insisted he escaped and lived under another name. Some insisted powerful Masons ensured the truth would never be known. Each version served a purpose. The murder version framed Masonry as capable of violence. The escape version framed the public as manipulated. The cover-up version framed public institutions as compromised. In every case, the point was the same. The fraternity's secrecy made definitive closure impossible. Before Morgan, conspiracy claims about Freemasonry existed in Europe and in America, but they were often theoretical, linked to revolutions and ideology. After Morgan, the suspicion had a domestic American case study. It involved local officials, legal procedures, and a missing citizen. It could be argued in a courthouse and then argued again in a newspaper. It could be used to build a party and win elections. It taught Americans that the question of secret societies was not only about strange rituals, it was about whether a private oath could rival public law. That lesson stayed in the culture, even after the party that carried it faded. By the time the United States entered its early national period, Freemasonry had already become familiar enough that it could function quietly in the background of public life. It was not a rare curiosity. It was embedded in towns, ports, and professional circles, and its members were often the same people building civic institutions. That is when symbols start to matter more than most people think they do. A young nation needs symbols because it needs legitimacy, unity, and a story it can display in public. A fraternity built on symbols, rituals, and private recognition is positioned to influence how a nation presents itself, whether by design, habit, or opportunity. In this chapter, the focus is not on what any one Mason privately believed, but on how certain images and civic choices became linked, fairly or unfairly, to the idea of a hidden system operating alongside the Republic. The Great Seal of the United States is the most durable example. Congress adopted the seal in 1782, after years of proposals and revisions. The reverse side shows an unfinished pyramid with 13 steps and, above it, an eye in a triangle surrounded by rays. The official description in the adopting resolution calls it a pyramid unfinished, and an eye in a triangle, in the zenith, with mottos that signal providence and a new era. It is also true that the reverse was never used as an actual seal for stamping documents, but it became famous later because it appears on the back of the $1 bill. The eye itself was not invented by Masons, but it was a familiar symbol in European and American religious art for divine oversight. In the Great Seal context, it was already being used to represent Providence watching over the American project. The eye had been proposed as early as 1776 by an artist consultant named Pierre-Eugène du Cimetière, and by the time the final design was approved, the eye was placed above the pyramid, with the pyramid's 13 steps interpreted as the original states: Those are the basic facts that can be traced through official accounts and early documentation. What turns the Great Seal into a central artifact in the secret story is that it sits at the intersection of civic authority and esoteric imagery. An eye in a triangle is simple enough to be read as God, but also specific enough to be read as an emblem of hidden knowledge. A pyramid is simple enough to be read as strength and duration, but also ancient enough to invite speculation about Egypt, initiatory traditions, and priestly power. Once you put them together, you have an image that behaves like a magnet. It attracts meanings, and it does not release them. This is where conspiracy narratives take over the interpretation. If the Great Seal is a public statement, then it can be treated as a message placed in plain sight. The argument is direct. The founders were not only building a government, they were encoding a system of belief into the nation's identity. The eye represents watchfulness and authority that does not sleep. The unfinished pyramid represents a project that is always under construction, guided from above, with a capstone that is never placed because the work is never finished. The mottos reinforce that reading. Annuit Keptis can be read as approval of undertakings, and Novus Ordo Seclorum as a new order of the ages. In a conventional view, this is the language of a new republic seeking providential blessing and historical significance. In a conspiratorial view, it becomes something else. It becomes a declaration that a new order is being built, not only politically but spiritually and structurally, and that the builders want the public to accept it without fully understanding it. The seal then becomes less like decoration and more like a signature, not a signature of a single person, but of a class of people who think in symbols, who use architecture as a language, and who believe that power is most stable when it is wrapped in meaning. Once you start looking at the early republic through this lens, Washington, D.C. becomes the obvious next subject. The capital was planned intentionally, not grown gradually like older cities. Congress created the Federal District in 1790, and President Washington commissioned Pierre Charles L'Enfant to design a city plan in 1791. That much is uncontroversial. What matters is the nature of L'Enfant's plan. It overlays a grid with wide diagonal avenues, circles, and major vistas that link symbolic centers of power. The plan is designed to make certain buildings dominant in the visual and spatial order of the city. It is a city built to be read, to guide movement and attention. That is why it invites claims of hidden geometry. If you want to find patterns, a planned city gives you material. The Smithsonian's National Postal Museum has addressed the popular claim directly and notes that L'Enfant was not a Mason, while also describing how his plan used focal points, open spaces, and a grid system that shaped the capital's structure. That fact does not end the speculation. For people who treat Freemasonry as a network rather than a single designer's hobby, it is enough that the city was commissioned by a president who was a Mason and built in an environment where Masons were active in public life. In that view, L'Enfant does not need to be a Mason for the plan to align with Masonic ideas about order, measurement, and symbolism. The city becomes a stage where those ideas can be expressed through architecture, regardless of who drafted the first lines on paper. From there, the claims become more specific and more detailed. People trace triangles and pentagrams across maps, connecting the White House, the Capitol, major circles, and certain monuments. They treat diagonal avenues as intentional alignments, like the lines of a compass drawn across the land. They argue that the placement of key buildings reflects a symbolic program, one that mirrors Masonic themes of East and West, light and darkness, ascent, initiation, and the movement from the rough to the refined. Some of these claims focus on the geometry itself. Others focus on ceremonies, because ceremonies are where symbolism becomes visible in public record. This is one reason the Capitol Cornerstone Ceremony of 1793 is cited so often. On the 18th of September 1793, George Washington laid the first cornerstone of the United States Capitol in a Masonic ceremony. Accounts describe a procession, Masons in regalia, and Washington participating in the rite. The Senate's historical account notes that Washington crossed the Potomac and was met by bands, a volunteer artillery company, and a delegation of Masons in full regalia, then took part in a grand procession from construction sites to the Capitol site. The architect of the Capitol also frames it plainly as a Masonic ceremony led by President Washington, preceded by a parade and followed by celebration. If you are looking for a moment when the fraternity touches the founding architecture of the nation in a literal way, this is it. It is not a rumor. It is a documented public event. That is why it carries so much weight in the secret story. It suggests that the building of the state was not only bureaucratic and legal, but also ritual. The cornerstone is not just a stone, it is a claim about foundation. When a president participates in a ritual that uses symbols of grain, wine, and oil, and does so in the presence of the public, the act can be read as civic piety or as an initiation of the Republic itself. The attraction of this material is that it is both ordinary and suggestive. In the 18th century, cornerstone ceremonies with ritual elements were not rare. They were part of a broader culture of public rites, processions, and civic religion. At the same time, Masonry had its own specific forms, tools, and language, and Washington's participation gave those forms national visibility. A person inclined to treat Masonry as a moral fraternity will see the ceremony as a symbolic gesture of unity and virtue. A person inclined to treat Masonry as an influence network will see it as a public marker that the fraternity is present at the creation of the nation's most important building. This is how the symbol story works. The same event can be framed as harmless tradition or as a deliberate signal, and when the event is tied to physical infrastructure that will last centuries, the signal appears permanent. A law can be amended. A building stands. Once you accept that symbols can be used as signals, you begin to see how the Great Seal and the city plan reinforce each other in the imagination. The Great Seal puts an eye above a pyramid and attaches it to the identity of the state. The city plan places power in a geometry of avenues and circles that can be interpreted as intentional. The Capitol Cornerstone Ceremony adds a ritual link between Masonry and the national architecture. Over time, this becomes an ecosystem of meaning. People who believe in a hidden order do not need a single smoking gun. They build a case by accumulation. They point to membership lists of founders, to lodges in port cities, to ritual participation in civic ceremonies, to public iconography that resembles initiatory symbolism, and to the fact that Masonry, unlike most civic clubs, relies on private recognition. They argue that the lodge operates like an internal passport system, allowing members to identify each other and cooperate across distance and party. They then look at early American state building, which required cooperation across distance and party, and conclude that the lodge provided an advantage that outsiders could not match. This line of thinking also changes how people read American money, seals, and monuments. The $1 bill, in particular, becomes a kind of portable conspiracy document because it carries the Great Seal reverse into everyday life. The claim is simple. If the symbol were meaningless, why place it where everyone will handle it? If it were only religious, why combine it with a pyramid rather than a more conventional Christian image? If it were only civic, why use Latin mottos that sound like a coded announcement? The official story answers those questions with the language of 18th century symbolism and classical education. The secret story answers them by treating the symbol as intentional concealment. The power is not in hiding the image, but in hiding its meaning in plain sight. That approach fits a broader pattern, often attributed to secret societies. They do not always hide their existence, they hide their operating system. At the same time, the record shows that these symbols were part of a wider symbolic vocabulary in the 18th century. The eye was used in religious and civic contexts, and Latin mottos were common among educated elites. The pyramid as a symbol of duration and strength also had non-Masonic interpretations. Even so, the overlap between common symbolism and Masonic usage is exactly what makes the conspiracy reading durable. If a symbol is used widely, then it can be used without raising immediate alarm. If it is also used inside the lodge, then it can function as a quiet nod to insiders. That dual function is central to the speculative interpretation. It allows believers to argue that the founders could embed lodge-aligned imagery without leaving explicit evidence of intent, because the imagery would still be defensible as ordinary classical symbolism. This is why the Great Seal remains the centerpiece. It is both publicly explained and privately resonant. Washington, D.C. continues to supply new layers to this interpretation as the city grows. New monuments and buildings are added across the 19th and 20th centuries. Each addition can be treated as part of an ongoing plan or as a coincidence. When the Washington Monument rises as an obelisk, it invites comparisons to Egypt, to sun worship, to ancient geometry, whether or not those comparisons were intended by the engineers and legislators who funded it. When new memorials align with existing axes, it invites the idea of a sacred layout. When ceremonies include Masonic participation, it reinforces the sense that the fraternity maintains a relationship with the civic core. Even when official accounts treat these as traditions and community involvement, the speculative reading frames them as continuity. A network that lasted through monarchy and revolution, through frontier expansion and civil war, would not be expected to announce itself loudly. It would be expected to persist quietly and to mark key points with ritual and symbol, not because those marks prove domination, but because they signal endurance. The lodge network that could link influential men could also draw boundaries around who belongs. In practice, many lodges reflected the racial and religious divisions of their societies. Those divisions mattered because they shaped who had access to networks and who did not. As the 19th century progressed, As the nation fought over slavery and built new forms of industrial power, the question of who controlled institutions became sharper. In that environment, a secretive fraternity that promised mutual aid could be seen as a civic support system or as a private gatekeeping mechanism. That tension becomes more intense when the country enters the post-Civil War era and organizations modeled on fraternal structure take on openly political and violent roles. It is in that setting that the story moves from symbols on paper and street grids on maps into darker questions about how ritual, hierarchy, and loyalty can be used in the real struggle for control. After the Morgan affair, Freemasonry did not disappear from American life. It adjusted. In many places, lodges became more careful about public image and more focused on charity and civic ceremony. At the same time, the country itself was changing in ways that made fraternal networks more valuable, not less. The 19th century United States was a place where formal institutions were often weak, where personal reputation mattered, where travel and relocation were common, and where political power was frequently exercised through relationships rather than through bureaucracy. A lodge offered a structured way to build trust across those conditions. It created a repeatable method for admitting members, testing loyalty, and organizing mutual aid. In an era before modern professional credentialing and before many forms of social welfare, fraternal membership could be a real form of security. That made it attractive to ambitious men. It also made it useful to men who wanted influence without public accountability. The country moved towards civil war with a political culture already shaped by private clubs and public suspicion, and after the war, it would rebuild itself in a way that magnified both. The Civil War did not just split a nation, it broke and remade social hierarchies. It produced millions of veterans, a generation of men who had lived inside strict chains of command and who returned to civilian life carrying habits of discipline, ritual, and group identity. It also left the South defeated, occupied, and politically unstable. The end of slavery created a new legal reality that many white Southerners refused to accept, and Reconstruction brought federal authority into daily life in the former Confederate states. In this environment, secret and semi-secret organizations multiplied. Some were harmless fraternities, some were armed groups. Many used similar methods because the problem they were solving was the same. How do you coordinate people when you do not trust the government, when you fear informants, and when you want to act without public scrutiny? The tools are predictable: oaths, signs, passwords, ranks, initiations, meetings at night, a shared narrative that gives members moral permission to do what they are doing. These tools existed long before Freemasonry, but Freemasonry had refined them into a respected social form. That is why its shadow appears in this period, even when the lodge itself is not issuing orders. The methods were in the air, and fraternal culture gave them legitimacy. One of the central figures who pulls Freemasonry into the story of the post-war South is Albert Pike. Pike was many things over the course of his life: a lawyer, a journalist, a poet, a military officer in the Confederate Army, and later the most influential administrator and interpreter of the Scottish Rite in the United States. He was not the only prominent Mason of his era, but he became a symbol because his career sits at the intersection of war, ideology, ritual, and institutional power. The Scottish Rite is one of the major systems of higher degrees in American Freemasonry. A man becomes a Mason in the basic 3 degrees. Then he can pursue additional degrees in systems like the Scottish Rite, which expands the ritual world into a larger structure of teachings, ranks, and titles. In the decades after the Civil War, Pike's authority in this system made him a gatekeeper of meaning for a large portion of American Masonry. He rewrote rituals, standardized degrees, and framed the Rite as a moral and philosophical project with deep historical roots. For supporters, he was a builder of coherence and tradition. For critics, he looked like a man who used ritual and myth to bind a brotherhood to a worldview, including a worldview shaped by the Confederacy's defeat and the social conflict that followed. Pike's influence also reflects a broader fact about the period. Fraternal organizations were a way for men to navigate loss, status anxiety, and political change. In the North, veterans joined the Grand Army of the Republic and other groups that reinforced Union identity. In the South, veterans formed networks that preserved Confederate memory and social hierarchy. Some of these networks were public and legal, some were not. What makes Masonry relevant is not that it necessarily caused these developments, but that it provided a respected template for structured male association. When a group wants to appear serious, it borrows a serious form. Masonry, with its degrees, regalia, and ceremonial language, provided a form that was already familiar to many elites. It also provided a way to connect local power structures across towns and states. A lodge could include judges, sheriffs, bankers, and clergy. That was not unusual. But in a period when the South was fighting over control of courts, policing, and elections, the presence of fraternal loyalty inside those institutions became politically charged. If the men who enforced the law also belonged to a private oath-bound circle, then outsiders could reasonably wonder where decisions were being made. This is the setting in which the Ku Klux Klan enters the story. The first Klan formed in 1,865 inches Pulaski, Tennessee, founded by former Confederate soldiers. It began as a social club of sorts, but it quickly became a vehicle for terror, aimed at enforcing white supremacy and undermining Reconstruction governments. The Klan did not invent secrecy or violence, but it combined them with performance and structure in a way that made it highly adaptable. It used costumes and titles. It used coded language. It created local units and higher leadership roles. It claimed to act in defense of a moral order. It also used intimidation, assault, and murder. The central question for this part of the story is why the Klan's organizational style looks familiar to anyone who studies fraternal culture. It is not only because many 19th century men belonged to lodges and fraternities. It is because the Klan consciously adopted the features that make a fraternity feel binding. It created a sense of belonging that could survive fear and secrecy. It offered initiation and hierarchy. It built identity through ritual. These are the same tools that make any covert network workable. But in the American context, they also resemble the outward forms of groups, like Freemasonry. This resemblance has led to a long-running claim that the Klan modeled itself on Freemasonry, or at least borrowed heavily from it. There are a few layers to this claim. One layer is simple overlap in membership. In the 19th century, Freemasonry was widespread among white professional men, including military officers. It is therefore unsurprising that some early Klansmen were also Masons. A second layer is structural similarity. The Klan used grandiose titles and a system of ranks that echoed the vocabulary of fraternal orders. A third layer is ritual similarity. The Klan used initiations, secrecy, oaths, and signs. This does not prove direct copying, but it supports the idea that fraternal forms were a known model for building a disciplined organization. A fourth layer is symbolic. Both Masonry and the Klan drew on imagined medieval chivalry, moral duty, and the idea of an elite brotherhood acting in defense of an order. In the Scottish Rite and other higher degree systems, there are rituals with knightly themes. The Klan presented itself in a twisted version of the same style, framing its violence as protection of community and virtue. This is not an endorsement of any kind. It is a description of how movements legitimize themselves. They wrap themselves in familiar moral language because naked power is harder to sell. The name most often used to connect these worlds is Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest was a Confederate cavalry commander, later associated with early leadership in the Klan. In many accounts, he is called the first Grand Wizard, though the Klan's early structure was not always consistent, and later narratives sometimes simplify it. Forrest's biography makes him a useful symbol because he embodies the post-war transition from battlefield command to shadow politics. He also had fraternal connections, including reported links to Masonry. That fact is often cited to suggest that the Klan's structure was not improvised, but borrowed from existing organizational habits. Whether or not Forrest personally imported Masonic practice into the Klan, the broader point remains that many Southern elites were familiar with lodge systems and could replicate their structure when creating new groups. Albert Pike is then brought back into the picture, often in a more speculative way. Pike was a Confederate general and a leading Scottish Rite figure, and critics have claimed that he was a direct architect of Klan ritual or ideology. The evidence for Pike's direct membership in the Klan has been disputed for a long time, and the historical record is not clean enough to state it as fact without qualification. What can be said more securely is that Pike's writings and leadership helped define a ritual world that appealed to men who liked hierarchy, symbolism, and elite identity, and that the post-war South was full of men who wanted exactly that kind of structure. In that environment, ideas and forms could move from one context to another without a formal transfer order. A man who attended lodge and then joined a political or vigilante organization would already know how to run meetings, how to enforce silence, how to create degrees of access, how to use ceremony to create loyalty. In a society full of such men, a violent organization could adopt fraternal forms quickly because the forms were already part of the local culture. It is also important to understand that the United States, after the Civil War, saw a broader boom in fraternal orders. The Odd Fellows, the Knights of Pythias, the Improved Order of Red Men, and many other societies grew rapidly. They offered insurance like benefits, burial support, social status, and community for men moving through a fast-changing economy. This mattered because it normalized the idea that private ritual and public respectability could coexist. It made the sight of regalia and secret handshakes familiar. In that environment, The distinction between a harmless fraternity and a political network could blur, at least in public imagination. When people suspected the clan or other groups of hidden coordination, they often reached for the most visible model of hidden coordination they already knew: Freemasonry. That is how Masonry became part of this story, even when it was not directly responsible. It was the established language of brotherhood and secrecy, and the clan was using a corrupted dialect of the same language. The racial dimension cannot be treated as a side issue because it shaped both the reality and the accusations. Many mainstream lodges in the United States excluded black men in practice, even when Masonry's official language spoke of universal brotherhood. At the same time, Black Freemasonry existed through organizations such as Prince Hall Masonry, which began in the late 18th century and grew over time. The existence of black lodges demonstrates that the tools of fraternity could be used in very different ways depending on the society in which they operated. For Black Americans, a lodge could be a vehicle for mutual aid, education, and civic organization in a hostile environment. For white supremacist groups, a secret fraternity model could be used to coordinate intimidation and violence. The overlap is not moral, the overlap is structural. The same organizational technology can be used for very different ends. This is also where the idea of conspiracy changes tone. Earlier suspicion of Freemasonry was often framed as a threat to democratic transparency or as an elite network with undue influence. In the post-war South, the suspicion becomes more concrete. People were being attacked and killed by organized groups operating behind masks. They were being driven from polling places. They were being punished for exercising rights. In such a context, the fear of hidden networks was not theoretical. It was grounded in lived experience of secrecy used for coercion. When citizens believed that local officials were sympathetic to the clan, or were members, or were unwilling to enforce the law, the logic resembled the logic of the Morgan affair, but with higher stakes. The question was again whether private loyalty could override public duty, but now the consequences included violence on a scale that changed entire counties and states. For Freemasonry itself, this period created a long-term reputational problem because it reinforced the suspicion that fraternal loyalty could shelter wrongdoing. Even if lodges did not endorse the clan, the broader culture of secrecy made it difficult for outsiders to separate one private network from another. When people hear that influential men belong to an oath-bound society, and also hear that a terror organization is organized around oaths and secrecy, they will assume relationship. They may be wrong about direct command links, but the suspicion does not depend on proof of direct command. It depends on plausibility. And plausibility comes from patterns, shared membership, shared culture, shared form. The Scottish Rite and Albert Pike remain central to this part of the story because they illustrate how ritual can be used to create a strong identity that feels larger than politics, even when it is shaped by political context. The Scottish Rite degrees in the United States emphasize moral lessons and allegorical history. They also use symbols and narratives drawn from many sources, including biblical scenes, medieval legends, and Enlightenment ideals. That gives the rite a sense of depth and authority. In the hands of a gifted organizer, it can become a system that binds men not only to each other, but to a worldview, one that interprets history as a struggle between order and chaos, light and ignorance, fidelity and betrayal. These are flexible categories. They can be applied in civic life, and they can also be used to justify exclusion. When a society is under stress, people do not usually tell themselves they are acting from fear or greed. They tell themselves they are defending order. That is why ritual language matters. It provides a story that makes hard actions feel principled. The post-Civil War decades were also the years when American public memory began to be managed. The lost cause narrative of the Confederacy developed through monuments, speeches, school books, and organizations that shaped how communities remembered the war. Fraternal culture fit easily into that project because it already valued ceremony and symbolic public acts. A procession, a dedication, a memorial service, these were familiar forms. Lodges and veteran groups used them to reinforce identity. This did not mean they were plotting in secret to control the nation, but it did mean they were participating in a struggle over what the nation would say about itself. And when powerful groups participate in shaping public memory, that is a kind of influence that does not look like ordinary politics, but can shape politics for generations. By the late 19th century, the United States had become a country where fraternal affiliation could still open doors, but where the public was also learning to read such affiliation as a sign of hidden alignment. Freemasonry remained socially respectable in many circles, especially among business and professional elites. At the same time, the growth of other secret and semi-secret groups, including violent ones, made secrecy itself look like a warning sign. The tension was not resolved. It hardened into a lasting feature of the American imagination. When people later looked for the roots of hidden power, they could point to this period and say the method was already proven. A man could belong to a private brotherhood, gain trust and access, and then operate in public life with that private loyalty as an advantage. A violent group could borrow the same organizational methods and use them for terror. The public could suspect that the respectable fraternity and the violent fraternity were different faces of the same deeper system. This is the kind of conclusion that thrives in societies where transparency is valued but not always delivered, and where the line between private association and public authority is not always clear. In the early 20th century, the fear of Freemasonry shifted from pamphlets and election speeches into state policy. It happened for a practical reason. Modern dictatorships were built on control of information, control of loyalty, and control of organizations that could mobilize people outside the state. Freemasonry had all the qualities these regimes disliked. It met privately. It maintained internal rules. It created bonds that crossed class lines and sometimes crossed borders. It used signs and words that allowed members to recognize each other without explanation. It kept membership lists and archives that were not public. Even when a lodge insisted it was not political, it was still a network. Authoritarian governments did not need proof that the network was plotting. They only needed to believe the network might become a rival source of allegiance. The pattern appears clearly in fascist Italy before it appears in Nazi Germany. Mussolini built power by absorbing or crushing independent institutions. In the mid-1922s, his government moved directly against Italian Freemasonry. A law in 1925 effectively banned the fraternity and fascist authorities seized the Grand Orient headquarters at Palazzo Giustiniani in Rome soon after. This was not a symbolic warning. It was an administrative takeover backed by police. Lodges were forced to shut down, records were confiscated, and membership became a liability in a regime where loyalty was expected to flow in one direction. The logic was simple. A man cannot serve two masters, and the state wanted to be the only master that mattered. The same logic would appear again and again across Europe. The uniformity is one reason the story has lasting force. Different regimes in different countries reach similar conclusions about the same type of organization. In Germany, the Nazis had a more elaborate ideological frame for the attack. They did not present Freemasonry merely as an independent association that needed to be dissolved. They presented it as part of a vast conspiracy. Nazi propaganda repeatedly linked Jews and Freemasons, pushing the idea of a Jewish Masonic plot against Germany. This framing served several purposes at once. It turned a domestic crackdown into a national defense project. It expanded the category of enemy beyond political parties and trade unions to include any group the regime wanted to destroy. It also made the persecution feel justified to ordinary citizens who were being trained to see hidden enemies everywhere. Once you tell the public that a secret society is working with an ethnic group cast as an existential threat, you can attach almost any policy to that claim. Police raids become rescue operations. Seizure of property becomes national security. Imprisonment becomes protection of the state. The administrative steps followed quickly. As the Nazis consolidated power, they pushed German lodges to dissolve, surrender assets, and hand over archives. Local pressure began in 1,933 inches many places, with lodges closing under threat, and the regime moved toward a complete ban. By 1935, the Nazi state had outlawed Freemasonry entirely. The point was not only to stop meetings, it was to capture the machinery of the network. Lodge buildings held records of names, addresses, degrees, correspondence, and charitable funds. Those archives were valuable for the kind of governance the Nazis practiced. It was government by file. The state did not have to guess who belonged. It could simply read the membership lists. That is why the seizure of lodge archives becomes one of the most important details in this part of the story. A private institution that relied on discrete records found itself facing a government that treated paperwork as a weapon. Once the state had names, it could apply pressure in layers. People who had been lodge officers could be identified. Civil servants and teachers with Masonic ties could be removed. Military officers could be questioned. Men trying to keep their jobs could be forced to sign declarations renouncing the fraternity. Even where there were no mass arrests at first, the effect was still punishment. Loss of career, loss of social standing, exposure as an enemy category. Then, as Nazi repression intensified and expanded, persecution moved from administration into imprisonment. Freemasons were among those sent to concentration camps, generally categorized as political prisoners in the camp classification system. The camps used badges to mark prisoners by category, and some sources note that Masonic prisoners were associated with the political prisoner marking, sometimes with an added identifier. In the logic of the camps, this classification mattered. It shaped treatment, labor assignments, and survival odds. In the logic of the Nazi state, It mattered because it turned membership in a fraternity into a punishable identity. To understand why the Nazi campaign against Freemasonry resonates, it helps to look at it through the regime's own fear of uncontrolled bonds. Nazi rule depended on replacing older loyalties with loyalty to the party and the leader. Churches were monitored, youth organizations were absorbed, worker groups were smashed and replaced. Freemasonry, with its transnational connections and its moral language that did not come from the party, represented a category the Nazis could not easily control from within. The fraternity's insistence that members owed special duties to each other could be read by the regime as an alternative chain of command. Even if a lodge never discussed politics, it still produced trust between men who might hold important roles. For a dictatorship, that was enough. The state did not need evidence of a plot to treat the organization as a potential competitor. It needed only the possibility that a loyal group might refuse an order, leak information, or coordinate resistance. This interpretation has fueled a darker speculative thread that runs through the larger conspiracy story. If the fraternity was harmless, why would dictators spend energy destroying it? The answer from within the secret story is direct. Dictators feared it because it was real power. They feared it because it had reach into elites. They feared it because it contained men trained in discretion and mutual aid. They feared it because it could hide in plain sight. The Nazis did not only arrest opponents, they hunted systems that could organize opponents. Freemasonry fit the profile of a system, especially in the paranoid worldview the regime promoted. The fact that Nazi propaganda obsessed over Jewish Masonic conspiracy gave this view a place to stand. If a regime is willing to build propaganda around a single combined enemy, it suggests that the enemy narrative was useful for governing, and usefulness often follows perceived threat. The persecution did not stop at Germany's borders. As Nazi influence spread across Europe through alliances, occupation, and pressure on neighboring regimes, the same hostility to Freemasonry appeared in different forms. In some countries, lodges were forced to close and their property seized. In others, Masons were monitored, arrested, or pushed into exile. This is where the story becomes more complicated, because each country had its own political structure, its own relationship between church and state, and its own history of anti-Masonic sentiment. But one theme repeats. Authoritarian systems treated lodges as a rival structure, and they treated secrecy as evidence of guilt. The act of meeting privately itself became suspect. Spain under Franco provides another example of how the anti-Masonic impulse became law. Franco's regime framed Freemasonry as a major enemy category and built a legal instrument to pursue it. In 1940, Franco enacted the law for the suppression or repression of Freemasonry and communism, and his state created special institutions to prosecute alleged Masonic activity. The framing is important. Freemasonry was placed in the same legal category as communism, despite being socially and politically different. This was not an accident. It shows how dictatorships use broad enemy categories to justify repression. Freemasonry was treated as a hidden force behind political disorder, a secret influence that had infiltrated institutions. That story allowed Franco's state to attack political opponents and social rivals under the banner of national cleansing. It also reinforced a European pattern. In the authoritarian imagination, Freemasonry is never just a fraternity. it is always an underground government. In Italy, the earlier fascist ban created a legacy that would matter long after the war. The 1925 crackdown did not erase the idea of a Masonic network operating beneath the state. It drove it underground, fractured it, and created room for clandestine forms to develop. When institutions are forced out of public view, two things can happen at once. Ordinary members drift away, and smaller circles with higher risk tolerance become more central. They meet quietly. They become harder to monitor. They may also become more tightly tied to political factions because survival requires protection. This is one of the structural reasons later scandals in Italy could carry a Masonic label. When a state bans a fraternity, it does not necessarily remove the social ties that fraternity created. It often changes how those ties behave. The United States watched much of this from a distance, but not from neutrality. American public culture had long carried suspicion about secret societies, and at the same time American civic life contained many fraternal orders. That meant the news of persecution could be interpreted in opposite ways. For some Americans, Nazi attacks on lodges were proof that Freemasonry was part of a broader liberal civil society the dictators were trying to crush. For others, the same attacks were proof that the dictators knew something the public did not, that Masonry really was an influence network worth dismantling. The second interpretation has always been the more conspiratorial, and it gained force as people looked for explanations that went beyond military strategy and ideology. If a regime hunted lodge archives and membership lists, perhaps those lists had real strategic value. If a regime sent Masons to camps as political prisoners, perhaps it considered them politically significant. Those inferences are not proof, but in the world of suspicion they do not need to be. They are treated as signals. There is also a more direct operational point that often gets overlooked. When Nazi authorities seized lodge archives, they did not only gain lists of names, they gained a map of relationships. Correspondence between lodges, records of visitors, letters of introduction, minutes that named officers and committees. Even if political discussion was banned in lodge rules, the records could still show who knew whom, who traveled, who held influence, who had money, who had ties abroad. In an authoritarian system, that is intelligence. It helps identify leaders, connectors, and possible sources of resistance. It can also be used for blackmail. An individual might not fear exposure as a Mason in a liberal society, but in a regime that frames Masonry as treason, exposure becomes a lever. That is why some of the most damaging consequences of persecution could occur without a trial. Pressure could be applied quietly, using the threat of denunciation. The public might never see the mechanism. The victim would. By the end of World War II, the physical destruction was obvious. Lodges had been closed, buildings repurposed or looted, archives scattered or destroyed, membership disrupted by exile, imprisonment, and death. The less visible effect was on the reputation of Freemasonry itself. The persecution added a new layer to the story that had already existed since the 18th century. Now Masonry was not only accused of causing revolutions or manipulating politics, it was also presented as a victim of regimes that claimed to fight hidden enemies. That dual identity is part of why the fraternity remains difficult to pin down in public imagination. A group that is attacked by dictators can be seen as a defender of civil society. A group that is attacked as a hidden conspiracy can be seen as confirmation that it had hidden power. The same historical record can support both readings, depending on what a listener already believes. After the war, Freemasonry rebuilt in Western Europe and continued in the United States, but the post-war world was not the same. Intelligence services, clandestine operations, and Cold War politics normalized secrecy in government itself. Networks of influence became more professional, finance became more international. Political conflict moved into covert channels. In such a world, a fraternity built on discretion could be treated as harmless tradition, or it could be treated as one more layer in a landscape already full of hidden structures. In places where democracy was fragile and corruption high, the idea that an inner circle could operate behind official institutions became more believable. And once that belief takes hold, the label Masonic becomes useful. It becomes a shorthand for a certain kind of covert coordination, whether or not the official fraternity recognizes it.